We would like to welcome Manish Gupta. Manish is the Director of Business and Technology Consulting at Microfocus, responsible for Enterprise DevOps. He brings rich international experience spanning 2 decades in the IT industry, with major focus on application delivery, automation, DevSecOps, and performance engineering. Manish would be speaking on shift left performance testing, which is an interesting topic, and you can get more details about Manish on this below video. Uh, I hand over to Manish.
So, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining this session. As was introduced, this session is on shift left or performance testing. And this is an area I picked because I think we are still struggling with making performance testing part of agile sprints, especially. I think functional testing has done pretty well in becoming agile. But before I get into the process itself and how we can make it shift left, just a quick word on what we are facing with today in terms of performance and why it matters. And with the internet economy, the high performing software is essential. Um, and what it means is that the user experience has to be superior. So if we look at numbers on the right side of your screen, right? Every minute of the day, we're talking about 400,000 apps downloaded, 4.5 million searches in Google itself. Netflix users are watching 764,000 hours worth of video. So, I won't go through each and every number, but I think the point is that today scalability of systems is something that everybody has to be worried about. Uh, we're moving to the cloud, it's omnipresent, omni-channel. We're talking about mobile, internet, uh, and all this is creating, and I think we've used the word digital transformation enough to understand that almost every organization today is going through this transformation where there are going to be more and more users who are going to be accessing their products, services through the digital channel, through the web, through the mobile. And making sure that the customer experience is good is becoming a prime goal for every organization. And as we move to Agile and DevOps, we're still, like I said, facing this challenge where performance testing is often the last mile, right? We still tend to do the performance testing at the end, just before go live in a UAT environment or in a staging environment, whatever you want to call it. And that still ends up with us having applications which have higher cost of change, production issues, and for a business, any downtime in production, especially if the application goes down because of increased load, is a big no-no today. So that's the problem that we are dealing with. And what are some of the root causes of this problem? If we think about it, we've seen organizations struggling with just a lack of alignment between the development and testing efforts, especially when it comes to performance. There are, of course, when it comes to performance, more and more technologies that and layers that we are talking about today, right? So there are services, there are containers, there is cloud, there is on-prem, and there are different flavors of the infrastructure itself, which makes it hard for performance engineers to troubleshoot, to find the root cause of problems, or even for the system engineers to do that. So that complexity essentially, like I said, is getting to be the root cause of performance issues. And finally, I think we are also dealing with growing cost. I think every organization today wants to minimize the cost that what it costs them to do their performance testing, keep their scripts updated, keep their environments for performance testing alive, and even access the load testing infrastructure. So all these factors we believe are putting the pressure on performance teams. So what it requires is a culture of performance engineering. And while we have this whole concept of load testing and stress testing and the performance tuning that goes along with already in place in many organizations, I think the performance engineering culture adds in other dimensions. For example, you're talking about virtualization today. How do you accelerate testing efforts by including the network conditions in your performance testing environment? How do you remove dependencies in the test environments using service virtualization? And of course, one of the other things when we talk about the performance tuning aspect is the integration with performance monitoring tools. We have profiling tools. You might have heard of tools like New Relic or Dynatrace. How can we integrate all those DevOps tools today to make performance engineering a culture as part of our performance testing discipline, so to say? So having said that, let me just re-emphasize what is the current state when it comes to the agile delivery and where performance fits in. So like I said, I think most organizations that I see still tend to do their agile sprints. They're building their features, they're doing some acceptance testing, they might be even rolling out code after a sprint or after a few sprints. But performance testing is happening as a one-off activity, perhaps by a performance engineering team. Perhaps it is not even in the sprint cadence, but it just happens after a set cadence, maybe once a year, maybe a couple of times a year, and not really aligned with the product releases from a sprint perspective. And this is something that I think organizations today are trying to achieve. How do we fit performance testing within Agile, right? So that every time we do a sprint, we do our acceptance test, we do our code push to production. Just before that, we should be able to do the performance testing on a regular basis. That's what performance testing in Agile is all about. That's what it means by shifting it left. Because once again, what we observe today is that it's really a late stage activity, and shift left is now a commonly used term, which means that you want to find these performance issues also as early as possible. While the developer is building software, as part of the sprint, if you are including some level of performance testing activity, at least you can find out whether your performance is degrading sprint to sprint. Whether it may not be a full blown test, but you still want to do in a limited environment, a small scale load test to understand how your performance goes from one sprint to the other. So to make that happen, to make it part of the sprint process, to make it shift left, it really needs performance engineering to be a team sport, which means that the developers or the dev testers today, the testers who are development centric, and the performance engineers who are today doing the late stage performance testing, they all need to get aligned, right? So what the developers can do in their limited test environment or the development workstation and assets that they build should be usable by performance engineers in the later stages when they do their more end-to-end performance tests. And if dev testers are involved, they have the responsibility of maybe building those test assets. So even Gartner says that it is everybody's responsibility today to have a performance first culture for an organization to succeed in the digital world. So what is the process that we are recommending as a best practices? In Agile, you want to add even the performance criteria to the definition of done, right? So that when the Scrum team creates their plan, the performance testing effort is already taken care of, when you plan your user story. So maybe a quality story around performance. And then the third stage is really where the pre-commit tests that the developer could just run. That was something I was just talking about on the developer machine, on the dev workstation. If I can do a small test, 20 users, 40 users, whatever small number, that helps me understand how my code performs with concurrency, right? Right now, what the developer is doing as a unit test is pretty much a single user test. But can we make that process, take it to the next level where the developer does some pre-commit test on his or her machine to understand whether the performance has degraded from my previous version of the code? And then, of course, once the code is being checked in, you want some level of performance testing to be integrated with your CI pipeline. And finally, we come to the late stages or the end-to-end performance testing in a full-blown environment, perhaps, which today the performance engineering team owns, and they would continue to do that. But what we are advocating is that the assets that we are building in the early stages in the shift left, those can be reused by the performance engineers in the later stages. So what does it require from a tooling perspective, right? So for the developer to shift the performance testing left, now we have to increase the productivity of the developer, right? We don't want the developer to go and learn a new tool for performance testing, go learn LoadRunner. That's unlikely to happen. So what's needed is that the developer should be able to stay within his or her IDE and be able to code some performance tests, build some performance test assets, and do that early stage performance testing within the dev environment. We need tool that can help that collaboration I was talking about, which means that if the developer is building assets in their IDE, the performance engineering team who are going to use these assets later on should be able to use the very same assets, which means we can enable these two personas to collaborate if the assets can be reused. We then want to, of course, execute these tests on local resources, integrated to the CI pipeline, like I showed on the previous slide. But also, if we were to increase the scale of this testing and make the same developer wants to probably test with a slightly higher load, maybe not on the dev environment with local resources, but just upload my test assets to the cloud and use the public cloud infrastructure to execute a larger load test. That is also a desired capability for such a tool. And last but not the least, we expect this tool to be free for developers. So if the developers in an organization, there are hundreds, thousands of developers, and if we want to promote a culture of shift left performance testing where the developers are going to start doing tests using performance tests using local resources, they want this tool to be free. So what I'm introducing here is LoadRunner Developer Edition. It's free. It's downloadable from the Micro Focus Marketplace. And this is a tool that lets the developers start building performance test scripts within their IDE, right? It's supporting that continuous testing process. So any IDE today, whether Atom or Visual Studio Code, Eclipse, you name it, right? We're supporting it. Also, it will integrate your testing with Jenkins, Bamboo, or any other CI tool that you are using today. Also good to know is that this is a cross-platform tool, right? Unlike the LoadRunner Professional, which everybody or many of you would have heard of, is a Windows-only tool. LoadRunner Developer can work in a Mac environment, on Linux as well, because it's essentially embedded within the developer IDE. It's got a JavaScript-based SDK, which means that latest web technologies can be tested easily. Typically in a performance test script, you want to do some manipulation or emulate some logic that the client is doing on the browser. Typically, that all JavaScript-based client-side code can be easily replicated within this SDK, and it's based on a DevWeb protocol. This is a new protocol we introduced. And by virtue of this DevWeb protocol, you are building your performance test within your IDE, but the same DevWeb protocol is also now available in the LoadRunner Full Edition, which the performance engineering teams are using. And like I said, it's free up to 50 users. So once you download it from the marketplace, every developer in the organization can run up to 50 user tests on their machines. But since I already said that this is built for collaboration, you want to collaborate with the performance engineering team who might be using the LoadRunner Professional or the LoadRunner Enterprise Edition. You can reuse the same test assets, but also you can scale your tests by uploading these test scripts to the cloud, which is the LoadRunner Cloud Edition. I'll talk about that, take a few minutes towards the end of this presentation. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to show you a quick demo of this tool. In this example, we are going to see how the developer who's writing the application code within their IDE and have already built a functional test case, unit test rather, for the UI. We are going to put a proxy recorder and record that traffic, which that functional test case is going to generate. And we are then going to learn it into a performance test script. So let me roll this video for you. And I'll do some narration. So this environment here is an Eclipse environment. We have the UFT developer plugin. That's the functional testing tool. And we're going to have LoadRunner Developer as the performance testing tool. So this is my functional test case. This is still not the performance test case, but what I'm saying is I will capture the HAR file or the HTTP archive file that gets generated as this functional test case is executed. So, it is not necessary that you should have your functional test case, but I'm going to just execute this using the JUnit framework. It's a UFT developer test case. And as this test is executing, this is my functional test case. In the background, I recorded the steps, and this has generated this aos.har file. Okay, using this har file, we are going to generate our performance test script. So we'll generate the LoadRunner developer script using this, and that churns out my LoadRunner developer script. I go to the main.js, and you can see this is my script. I can add some transaction markers. I can do any data parameterization I want to do, but this is all JavaScript interface. The functions also that you see here are based on the JavaScript SDK. So I added 2 transactions, and now I'm going to define a scenario. I want to run 20 users of this particular test that does a shopping activity for a duration of 20 minutes. And as I run this test, I'm also going to run a long-running functional test. So what you see on the screen in the browser, that's the functional test running. And alongside, I'm going to run that 20 users using LoadRunner Developer. And on the left side, I have the Grafana dashboard in which I can see the traffic that's coming to my application, the number of users that I'm running, the hits per second, etc. So that gives me a good sense of how the performance is behaving, but I can also go back to the functional test results in UFT Developer and see that for the 20 minutes that my test was running, I had the UI test also running, so I can capture the end-to-end response time, perhaps in my UI test, right? Another way to look at it is I can see whether my functional test case is passing as the unit test, as the load test is running. So within a single IDE, I've been able to handle my application development, functional testing, as well as performance testing. So I hope you like that video. Next up, I'm going to talk about LoadRunner Cloud. So remember I said you want to shift left your performance testing, you're using LoadRunner Developer, but you're only doing up to 50 users. Now, what if you want to scale your load testing? So LoadRunner Cloud is our public cloud-based load testing solution. It's fully native public cloud based on AWS and Azure, and it leverages the public cloud infrastructure to scale your performance testing. So you can upload your existing LoadRunner scripts, you can upload your LoadRunner developer scripts, and by the way, you can upload the LoadRunner developer scripts directly from the IDE, and you can start running your load test, and you can scale. We've run tests for up to even 5 million concurrent users using this platform for some of our customers. Okay, like I said, you can distribute the load across multiple locations of AWS and Azure. We are already supporting a couple of dozen locations on these public cloud providers. And the good thing is that the licensing is very flexible. So you only pay for what you consume. It's not like a perpetual license you buy and it sits there for you. So once you buy it in a virtual user hour model, you would only consume the licenses for the duration of the testing that you have executed. And then again, to the topic of the Agile and DevOps teams who want to quickly get up and running on performance testing, it's not hard to believe that within 10 minutes, you can get up and running with this tool and have your performance test running. We've seen this with some of our customers who actually came to us during the COVID lockdown period, where suddenly they had an increased load on their applications and they wanted to test their application load for increased users, and they wanted to do it in a hurry. They could just sign up for a subscription and get up and running within a couple of minutes, hours, etc. Okay. You can, by the way, also run open source scripts like JMeter on the LoadRunner Cloud platform. You also have REST APIs exposed for this tool, so you can integrate it with Git, you can integrate it with your CI tools. And on the next slide, I am going to show you a complete ecosystem of the DevOps tools that you can actually integrate LoadRunner with and make your performance testing more realistic. Okay, so like I said, very rich set of integrations. This is not the full set, but I think the most common CI tools we see out there, some of the open source tools like JMeter or Gatling, where people are building test assets, you can upload those. Integrate your LoadRunner Cloud to Git so that you can save your test scripts to Git repository. We are also supporting Docker containers for some of the on-prem LoadRunner solutions. And then when it comes to the APM tools, the performance monitoring tools, we provide integrations with New Relic, Dynatrace, and App Dynamics out of the box. So these integrations can actually, make it possible to include LoadRunner Developer within the DevOps toolchain, within your DevOps process, and make performance testing a team sport. Make sure that you can test early, not having to wait for days or months for the performance testing infrastructure to arrive, for the licenses to arrive, etc. Okay, it also has, of course, a very rich set of analytics and reporting capabilities that make it possible to identify the performance bottlenecks very easily. Okay, the last slide, I wanted to just take a minute to talk about another product or another solution in the market that is service virtualization. What is the use case? A lot of times we see when it comes to performance testing or even functional testing, because of the distributed nature of your application environment, right? Depending today on a lot of backend services, REST APIs probably provided by third parties, or even within your enterprise, there are other systems that this new application that you're building has to integrate with. The challenge sometimes we see is that these environments are not available to everybody who's doing the dev and test work. So let's say you're building a new mobile application, but you have dependency on the backend SAP or a third-party REST API for payments. Not having this environment makes it difficult to do some end-to-end testing or integration testing possible because of the lack of environment. So what happens is we are waiting. We're waiting for environments to be available. And that is preventing that shift left, which means I'm not able to test early in the life cycle. I have to wait for environments as they become available later on. So the solution is to be able to learn these third-party services, these dependent systems in terms of the traffic, simulate it, and simulate the data model, simulate the performance models, regardless of the protocol, whether it's REST or MQ, JDBC, or any of the communication layer over which your application communicates with these backend systems, virtualize them and learn and virtualize them in this solution so that you can eliminate the constraints in the architecture that are preventing the testing to shift left, that are preventing you to run more end-to-end scenarios in your testing early on in the life cycle, right? And by simulating the data and performance scenarios, you can actually increase your test coverage, do more scenarios, test with realistic conditions. And finally, this also helps reduce infrastructure cost because the amount of money that needs to be spent on setting up some of these backend infrastructures in testing is still a huge cost for organizations. And by learning the behavior of these applications or services and simulating them in a virtual service model brings down that infrastructure cost significantly. So those are the three things in summary: the LoadRunner Developer that enables the developers and dev testers to start creating performance testing early on the life cycle within their IDE. And we talked about LoadRunner Cloud, which lets you quickly scale your tests. And finally, close this with service virtualization so that environments are available early on. Okay, so that brings me to the end of my presentation. I will stop sharing my screen and see if there are any questions.
One question was from Shweta, which other open source or completely free tool would you recommend for better adoption of performance testing by the entire team?
Okay, Shweta puts me in a bit of a dilemma here because I represent Micro Focus. I would still urge Shweta to consider LoadRunner Developer. It's free, and the advantage is that if you want to scale the testing, you don't have to worry about scaling it beyond LoadRunner Developer. So you can use the LoadRunner Cloud Edition, or even later on, if the LoadRunner Enterprise or Professional editions are in use in your organization, those same assets can be used by the performance engineering team. But like I said, even in the LoadRunner Cloud slides, I showed you that we are also supporting JMeter script. So JMeter is a popular open source tool. And if an organization has already started off with JMeter, and then they want to scale their JMeter based testing, they can still come to our LoadRunner Cloud platform.
Great. There is one question that how the tool which we have in Microsoft is different from Google Lighthouse. You know, the LoadRunner Developer, how it is different than the Google Lighthouse.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with Google Lighthouse, just heard about it. But in terms of capabilities, again, I think it's not just about LoadRunner Developer, right? I said, while that is good to start performance testing in a shift left mode, and this across large enterprises, you still need to do the more end-to-end testing. You still need to, do testing with a lot more scenarios that might be possible within the dev environment, where you probably do more unit test-based scenarios. I think the big differentiator, not just with Google Lighthouse, but with any other tool that I come across, is the analytics capability. I think that's where commercial tools add a lot of value. So while in LoadRunner Developer, we are doing the analytics using Grafana, InfluxDB, which are open source based. But when it comes to our enterprise editions of the product, which are paid tools, our own analytics is really designed to help you find that needle in the haystack. What I mean by that is, when a lot of times with performance testing, if you're running thousands and thousands of users, you're collecting so much data, right, across those thousands of virtual users, maybe dozens of test scripts, millions of rows of test data that has gone into that whole test scenario. And then you have a failure, and then you have an application performance degradation or a performance problem. Now you need to find out the root cause, what failed, which user failed, what test data failed. I think that's where the analytics that is required, to be able to drill down and find out the root cause. That's where we really do, very well. Okay. So throwing load at an application today, yeah, that is probably a commodity. But being able to analyze and understand the root cause of the problem, that's where we stand out.
Yeah, I agree. It's very important to have the root cause. There is another question which is, do you have the repository available on GitHub that you used in the demo?
Okay, so maybe I'll break this question into two parts. There is the tool itself. So I think I mentioned, if you go to marketplace.microfocus.com and you sign up, you'll be able to download LoadRunner Developer. Now you can start using the tool. Now, in terms of the test scenario itself, that is based on a sample application, which is Advantage Online Shopping. I think you might have seen it in the morning demo as well, where we were showing the UFT AI capability. It's our own in-house sample application for online shopping. So that's something that we're not, those test assets we're not publishing, but you can use any application to try this tool on, and you can build your own test assets.
Great. And the last question, which is, how and when do you handle the performance debt, after it has been identified by performance test? More like, how we have technical debt is something like
Yeah.
performance.
Yeah, this is an ongoing issue, right? And that's why we are talking about making this performance testing an early in the life cycle activity, right? So that, why do we end up with that? Because by the time we find these performance issues, it's too late, and we can't re-engineer, we can't re-architect our application, and then we just live with that debt, right? Sometimes the debt is because of legacy reasons. Somebody else built it, and we've just inherited that legacy. So there's no straight answer to this, I guess. If you're stuck with that debt, I've seen a couple of paths people take. They embark on a modernization strategy. It requires investment. You have to probably re-architect, re-engineer your application. But just so that you don't end up with a lot of performance debt and you start fixing performance issues early in the life cycle, that's where this shift left concept, I think, is picking up in the industry. That's why we were motivated to launch LoadRunner Developer as a tool this year. It's actually, less than 12 months old.
Okay, great. I think one more question is from Deepti is what is the advantage of Micro Focus over other tools?
I think I just answered that when we talked about the analytics part. So
Yeah,
I
I
would
think
just
that is.
re-emphasize that, when it comes to performance testing, it's certainly the analytics, the ability to drill down, find the root cause of problem, and also, of course, the accuracy in terms of consistently generating load. But if it is a wider, micro focus related question, even other tools like UFT, which were not part of this session, but we talked about it in the earlier session, then yes, we are infusing UFT with AI capabilities. If you look at our ALM tool set, that's very open, based on integrations with a lot of tools in the life cycle, making it very, very collaborative. When it comes to service virtualization, again, I think we are the only credible vendor today in the market for service virtualization. So yeah, it depends on the tool, but from a performance testing perspective, I think I just answered that a few minutes back.
Yeah, a quick question actually, because I just came to question that about the API level performance. We are
Hmm.
doing more on the UI stuff. What about the API level performance? Is it also part of the tool which also handles
Yeah,
the?
so LoadRunner Developer now also. So while LoadRunner, the earlier, the Enterprise Edition has already been supporting the API based load test for many, many years. When we introduced this Dev Web protocol and the LoadRunner Developer, in the beginning, it was mainly catering to and again, from a UI perspective, also the traffic that you're recording is eventually hitting the APIs. But I think a lot of times we are talking about testing APIs in silos. Typically, a performance test is an end-to-end flow, the way you saw it in the example, where start. You look at it from a scenario perspective. So you log in, you add an item to the cart, you check out. So you're actually tying together multiple API calls into a business process flow. But if, let's say, just as a development activity, you're building APIs and you don't have the full end-to-end system yet, and you just want to stress the API and see how that API performs, yes, LoadRunner Developer is also now supporting that.
Great, Manish. Actually, it was a very useful session, and because this is performance testing is the key thing which people are looking around, and
Yep.
hope this micro focus tool will give them a lot of capabilities in terms of analyzing and getting the root cause, which you rightly mentioned, root cause to the issues, so that they can resolve it and again retest it.
Yeah, I put that URL in the chat window, marketplace.microfocus.com, and you should be
Yeah.
able to download LoadRunner Developer free of cost from there.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's great. That's great, Manish. Excellent. Excellent. Thank you, Manish.
Thank you. Thank you
And
for the opportunity to present here.